to thank my student, Michael Pai, who is the president of the Russian Eurasian Student Organization, for submitting all this paperwork for Professor Hill's visit. And the title of today's lecture is The Figures of Dissidence, Solzhenitsyn and Navalny. Please help me welcome Professor Hill.
So as you can already see from the subtitle of my talk, I've promised to bring together two figures who are separated by a great gulf in time, but who are today part of the same canon of Russian dissidents. One was a politician, and one was an author, but there's a strong overlap between these two vocations, especially when we consider the long history of authors speaking to power in the Russian tradition, and politicians speaking through the written word to the people, from poet Alexander Pushkin, to Tolstoy, to Lenin and Trotsky, to the great Soviet dissidents as well of the 1970s. Both of these two were political figures who took aim at the powers of their homeland and of their respective nations. And I think that there is a thread running through this talk today, thinking about the idea of Rodina, or homeland, a native land, and the profound attachment that adheres to these figures, as well as a political power that calls up a different kind of obligation and duty to speak. This will pull at the tension between belonging to a nation as a citizen, be it the Soviet Union or contemporary Russia, and what it means for each of these men to be entered by force into the subjecthood of a prisoner. Both of my heroes today were nationalists, and not liberal in any sense that we would characterize liberalism in the West. So we have to have this caveat as well. Although a victim of Stalinist repressions and a courageous voice speaking against Soviet totalitarianism, Solzhenitsyn's turn to a Slavophilic Russian orthodoxy later in his life also saw him welcome Putin's rise to power in 1999. Solzhenitsyn praised Putin vociferously for restoring Russia's national pride. His 1990 essay, which is called Rebuilding Russia, criticizes the Soviet government's haphazard border policies that he says carved up a traditional Rus. Here he advocated a Russian union encompassing Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and the ethnic Russian parts of Kazakhstan, which looks strikingly like some actions that Putin is taking today. Navalny was also a clear Russian nationalist. Not only did he back Putin's invasion of Georgia in 2008, describing Georgians as rodents, he also used additional ethnic slurs to describe others from the Caucasus. He further framed himself as someone who would remove non-white immigrants from Central Asia and the Caucasus by ruthlessly deporting them, as journalist Terrell Star wrote in 2021. He did dial back many of these comments, where they were seemingly tempered by his sympathy with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US a few years ago. But this is still a deeply complicated picture. Now, these two figures as dissidents and as political figures and as icons are uniquely Russian, even as they relied on the gaze and readership of the West to amplify their voices and claim legitimacy outside of closed media spheres at home. The loudspeaker of the West amplified their voices and shaped their figures of dissent. For me today, and the rest of this talk, the how of the communication and how that communication happens is a key part of the story of what they were able to say and how they were canonized as icons of dissidence. Navalny and Solzhenitsyn were each victims of a system of repression who were able to take the reins of the means of media production in their hands in order to speak and continue speaking beyond a single moment in time and well beyond the confines of their cells. So let's look at some of these parallels. I'm going to start with visual archaeologies, and don't worry, just as a roadmap, there's only two parts, so when we get to part two, you're in the second part. This is part one. Before we dive into a look at the Gulag archipelago, and actually the book is sitting in the room, this is the first I'm going to talk a bit about actually this publication of the Gulag archipelago, as well as an idea and as a book. So before we dive into a look at that book, and including where we might pinpoint some of Navalny's history of incarceration therein, I want to give a short introduction to Solzhenitsyn, as his name might be more distant than that of Navalny today for some in the room. Solzhenitsyn, from the Russian Revolution onward until his arrest, was a devoted communist. During World War II, he became an officer in the army and then a decorated captain. He was arrested in 1945 when counterintelligence agents intercepted letters between Solzhenitsyn and Another Friend on the Front, which contained vague criticism of Stalin. He was, like many political prisoners at this time in Soviet history, moved through several Gulag camps during his imprisonment. He worked at a camp near Moscow in 1946, which was involved in construction. Later, from 1950 to 1953, he was imprisoned at a camp in Kazakhstan for political prisoners, where he worked as a bricklayer and a smelter. This would be the setting for his famous novella, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Has anybody read A Day in the Life? A few? A couple, okay. I highly recommend it. Gulag Archipelago, too long. A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, 100 pages. You can get through it very quickly. He was released after his time in Kazakhstan and sent into exile in 1953 and had to remain in Kazakhstan as many political prisoners did. Most were not allowed to return to urban Soviet society for a set period of time. In 1957, during the thaw under Khrushchev, he was rehabilitated and moved to a small town near Moscow where he began to write in secret. In 1961, Solzhenitsyn submitted his manuscript for A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich to the thick journal Novy Mir, New World, which is his account of a day in the life of an average Soviet Gulag prisoner. When it was published in 1962, Solzhenitsyn became an immediate literary celebrity, both at home and abroad. However, apart from a few short stories, the Soviet press did not publish any of his other works which fictionalized his experiences in the Gulag, including The First Circle and Cancer Ward, which is also sitting on the table here, which circulated in what is called samizdat, or self-publishing in the underground. Today I'm going to tell some of the story of how he published his monumental literary investigation, The Gulag Archipelago, the other book on the table, which is a journalistic literary experiment exposing the history and experience of the system of the prison camps that made up the Gulag. This was a project that provoked outrage on the part of Soviet authorities and led to his expulsion from the Soviet Union. So when we speak of the Gulag and the history of forced labor camps, it's important to remember that this story is predicated on invisibility. In her seminal work called On Photography, published the same year as the English translation of Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, Susan Sontag claimed that there were no photographs of the Gulag. Certainly in comparison to the number of images taken inside Nazi concentration camps and upon their liberation by Allied forces, there are almost no images of the Soviet Gulag. This is because the system of forced labor camps that made up the Gulag were kept largely out of view, with a few moments of rare exception. The most high-profile exception was the propaganda campaign that celebrated the forced labor project at the site of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, or Belomor Canal, construction project between 1933 and 1934. The Belomor construction project was documented and shaped for domestic and foreign audiences in film. There's a musical dedicated to it. Photo montages in the pages here of USSR in Construction, which is a massive journal, and the hybrid photo illustrated space of The History of Construction, which was a book published in various luxury editions in 1934. Under the watchful eye of Stalin, who's made manifest here in the frontispiece. This is a collectively authored volume which made reforging, in Russian Verikovka, its primary focus, documenting a Gulag prisoner's rehabilitation as he was reforged into a new productive Soviet subject. In so doing, it hid the story of hundreds of thousands of prisoners who died in the process of construction. Anne Applebaum, a Gulag historian, comments on the particular dilemma of reading Gulag photographs like those contained in these propaganda pieces, noting in particular the contingency of photography's relationship to truth-telling. She suggests a way out of a neatly framed account of these propaganda pieces, like The History of Construction, by calling on us to leave the text behind and look at these images with a different kind of imagination, one that utilizes visual archaeology. You cannot merely look at the photographs and understand automatically what it is that you are seeing. Instead, you must look at them while simultaneously intuiting or imagining or inventing all of the things they do not and cannot show. She says you must look at the pictures of musicians in a brass band and remember that they were probably covered with lice. Not all of these photographs are dishonest, but they do not tell a whole story. We, as readers, historians, human observers, are tasked with becoming archaeologists in order to not only uncover what we can of this life, but also to interpret these remnants, be they written documents or photographs. Solzhenitsyn begins his first volume of the Gulag archipelago, history, with his own take on a kind of archaeology, or perhaps even better and more accurate, ichthyology. The author Solzhenitsyn frames his literary experiment with a metaphorical encounter with an unexpected slice of the Gulag experience. And what I have up here on the screen is actually a 1973 excerpt from the Gulag archipelago, which was published on the front page of the New York Times to give you a sense of what a media sensation it was in the West as well when it was published initially, but not in the Soviet Union. The author recounts coming across an article from the magazine Nature in 1949 containing an account of an archaeological dig near the Kolyma River, the site of a notorious Gulag camp, where archaeologists happen upon a prehistoric salamander or fish. They find the animal so perfectly preserved that they are able to eat it with gusto, with relish, охотно, on the spot. Solzhenitsyn goes on to state that the magazine's account undoubtedly astonished its readership with the novelty of a fish being preserved in such a state. And I'm going to read from this extensive piece. But few indeed among its readers were able to decipher the genuine and heroic meaning of this incautious report. For us, however, we understood instantly. We could picture the entire scene right down to the smallest details. How those present broke up the ice in a frenzied haste, how flouting the higher claims of ichthyology and elbowing each other to be first, they tore off the chunks of the prehistoric flesh and hauled them over to the bonfire to thaw them out and bolt them down. We understood because we ourselves were the same kind of people as those present at the event. We too were from that powerful tribe of Zeks, Zaklutchyonya, the imprisoned ones. Unique on the face of the earth, the only people who could devour prehistoric salamander with relish, with gusto. So here, through the lens of his own native attention, Solzhenitsyn reveals what the naive readers of Nature could not see, the microgeographical significance of the pinpoint, where that scene takes place. Solzhenitsyn is focused on the tribe of Zeks, Gulag prisoners, through the place where they are bound, Kolyma, the site of one of the most notorious and horrific Gulag camps, who are so driven by hunger to eat a prehistoric salamander. The visceral impact of this anecdote brings the reader to enter physically and intellectually into the consciousness of Solzhenitsyn's tribe in order to approximate what it might mean not only to tell his story, but to feel it as well. Now, as I revisited Solzhenitsyn's image dug up from the frozen tundra, I felt pulled to see what I could find in unearthing another visual archaeology around Alexei Navalny. Navalny's history as a political prisoner ended at Ikath 3, a penal colony where he was sent for his final prison transfer and where he spent his last months before his death in February of this year. The Ikath 3 penal colony was founded in the 1960s after the disbanding of the Soviet Gulag labor system, and it's located north of the Arctic Circle near Khark, about 1,900 kilometers or 1,200 miles northeast of Moscow. It's near the number 7 on this map. If I could get my cursor, you see the number 7 up high in the middle. This penal colony is notorious not only for its harsh conditions today, but also for that Gulag past on which it is built. Ikath 3 is located close to the so-called start of the Road of Death railway line in Solikhar. That is another infamous site of a Soviet forced labor project. So in addition to projects like the Baltic White Sea Canal and Belmore Canal project, much forced labor was also dedicated to building railway lines. And in a strange, but not seemingly now uncommon parallel to Solzhenitsyn's story of the frozen salamander, a frozen mammoth was unearthed here in 2007. In Nature reports, the scientists were quoted as stating that the year-round sub-zero temperature conditions were ideal to preserve the juvenile mammoth for 42,000 years. To add more color from these reports, they say of this place where the penal colony is also located, is about a 4-day journey from Moscow and is the only town in the only Russian town in the Arctic Circle. Although it's inaccessible across the frozen river for 10 months of the year, Twice a year, when the ice is floating down, when the ice is floating, the town is cut off from the rest of the world. Navalny's message to the world from this distant, frozen wasteland in December of 2023 is fully emblematic of his persona. In a post to Facebook and Instagram, he wrote through his lawyer and social media team, "I am your new Father Frost, Ded Moroz. Well, I have now a sheepskin coat, a nushanka hat, that's the hat with the ear flaps, and soon I will get valenki, traditional Russian winter footwear." He notes that he hasn't seen much other than the inside of his cell and the limited view through his window. There he says, "It's true there are no reindeer, but there are huge, fluffy, very beautiful German shepherds. I don't say ho, 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 but I say oh, oh, oh when I look outside the window, where first it's night, and then evening, and then night again." And why is that?
Time.
Yep. That Arctic Circle, in the winter, it is eternal night. Right? The sun never rises. Juxtaposing our images of the frigid, frozen north, we might recall a question that Solzhenitsyn asks in his novella, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Can a man who is warm understand a man who is freezing? Solzhenitsyn asks us to overcome that threshold, to see and feel with the eyes and stomach of a frozen Zek. Navalny, however, will ask you to laugh at the absurdity of his extreme and deeply Russian condition, recognizable even in that everyday wear that he calls out in that text. Everyday winter wear, I should say. To enter into a Russian national character through his suffering, turned into painful and ridiculous laughter. Now, Navalny's message from Katherine is also all about localization. This is a distinct pinpoint on the map, where he is, the Arctic Circle, in his cell. And the difficult and also strange route that he took to get there, he includes here as well. They brought me in on Saturday evening, and they transported me with such precautions and along such a strange route. And he gives us the route: Vladimir, Moscow, Chelyabinsk, Ekaterinburg, Kiev, Vorkuta, and Kharkiv. That I didn't expect anyone would find me here until mid-January. So this note stresses both isolation and distance, while making a place that is usually invisible to the vast majority of Russians, as well as certainly the West, visible. Does anything else strike you in this photograph? Just really quickly, maybe you see this, and you think, what immediately? We'll come back around to it, but if there's anything that just strikes you that seems strange, odd, or normal.
Is it no to war?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it looks like in the back. No to war, potentially? Keep that in mind. So do you think, well, I'll just go ahead and lay my hand out. Do you think that this was taken in prison?
No.
Right, just to keep this in mind as we move forward. Now, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag archipelago opens with its own textual map, of course. The map of the interconnected Gulag camps that did not appear on any official Soviet atlas. And this is a contemporary rendering from Gulag Online, which actually is a great resource if you're interested in exploring contemporary histories being written about specific Gulag camps across the former Soviet Gulag. What Solzhenitsyn says of the Gulag: the archipelago crisscrossed and patterned that other country within which it was located, like a gigantic patchwork, cutting into its cities, hovering over its streets. Yet there were many who did not even guess at its presence, and many, many others who had heard something vague. And only those who had been there knew the whole truth. Now, Navalny, in March 2021, reminds his followers of the similarities to the contemporary Russian penal system. At the time of this arrest, with a photo a little less sanguine than the one I just posted, but a textual picture no less cheeky, he states, 3 things never cease to amaze me: the starry sky above us, the categorical imperative inside us, and the amazing feeling when you run your palm over your freshly shaved head. Hello, everyone, from Enhanced Control Sector A. I have to admit that the Russian prison system was able to surprise me. I didn't imagine that it was possible to set up a real concentration camp 100 kilometers from Moscow. This, while full of dark cheek, would not have served to surprise Solzhenitsyn, the author also of a novel fictionalizing his own experience at a Moscow-based Gulag laboratory in his first circle. It would not have surprised him at all. Now, Navalny is able to flash these pictures of incarceration through the cracks of social media because of his celebrity and connections, made before and through his incarceration. I was having trouble trying to encapsulate the number of times he was arrested and sentenced between the years 2011 and 2024. Just a preview, it's on 2 slides. So here, just trying to create a picture of how many times he had been arrested and sentenced. In December 2011, he was arrested for speaking at an opposition rally. In 2013, he is sentenced for embezzlement, which of course he denied. In August 2020, he was poisoned by the Soviet nerve agent Novichok. In 2021, he's arrested for violating his parole, as he could not meet the regular check-ins due to his poisoning, as he was in Germany at the time. And in March 2022, he was sentenced to a prison term on fraud charges. In December 2023, he was hit with a last charge of vandalism while in isolation. You can think about the absurdity of that. I lay this mass of arrests and charges to make clear that his identity has come to be tied to repeated incarceration, as well as the Western public's need to see and feel proof of life moments. We know he was there, and we demanded to see him. Now, these proof of life moments really read as performative acts. We'll also emphasize this here. So again, the performative act of including an account from his penal colony and his current condition, and then a photograph clearly taken when he was on the outside, right, this juxtaposition. Now, the significance of photography within the space of the camp, both today and yesterday, runs very deep. And Navalny, I think, is clearly playing with that whole. Gulag and prison dossiers more generally are created by the click of the camera at the prisoner's very entrance into the camp system. The arrest photo, as part of that prisoner's dossier, signifies the moment in which the prisoner's likeness is captured and frozen, like that salamander or the tiny mammoth encased in ice. As the photograph is taken, so too is the freedom of the prisoner. They are no longer the authors of their personal narrative. Rather, their subjectivity, their very self, is shaped by the frames of image and text mandated by authority and ideology. In Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, this freezing of an unalterable image is suggested by the case of a character named Cesar. From the novella, Solzhenitsyn writes, Cesar had a heavy black walrus mustache. They'd have shaved it off, only he was wearing it when they photographed him for the record. More explicitly in the Gulag archipelago, Solzhenitsyn links this kind of photographic capture with the removal of individual subjectivity. Upon entering the camp system, the prisoner receives his number, thereby removing that human individuality, his I, yeah. To concretize this moment, he's then photographed with the identifying number hanging on a placard around his neck, or here tied to his jacket, in this case, SHA 262. The record created by the camera is the material extension of the control the camp exerts over the prisoner. Not only is he physically controlled in the space of the camp, his image and identity is trapped within the frames of that photograph. So more so than, of course, the passport document which allows one to move, the dossier in a Zek's life is both to be read and to be written. And when we think about this in the case of both Navalny and so many Gulag prisoners, this narrative may not be in any way true, even as it determines the confines and identity of that subject, living with an identity that is not yours, that keeps you confined. Paradoxically, by being turned into photographic material, the prisoner's identity can then be also hidden from view. The prisoner's photo is buried in that dossier as the prisoner himself is hidden from outsiders by the walls of the camp. As Solzhenitsyn parenthetically muses in Gulag Archipelago, all these photographs are still preserved somewhere. One of these days, we shall see them. And this image on the right is actually included as one of the authorial frontispieces in this Gulag Archipelago. This is a picture of Solzhenitsyn taken inside the camp. It's a series of photos here. You're on to part 2. Now, Navalny was clearly aware of that power of seeing throughout his incarcerations, and the fact that his image would be reproduced on a mass scale on the internet. He was aware of tension between visibility and invisibility. And if we look briefly at his arrest photos, we can repeatedly see, well, I see something. Do you see something? Is there anything that seems to unify these, especially in contrast to Solzhenitsyn?
Smile.
Smile. He's always smiling in these images, and I think you can even see it in the arrest photos as well. Navalny and his core team had already mastered the use of social media networks before his arrest, the popular power of the World Wide Web. The introduction of the internet changed the media architecture of a post-Soviet Russia, as the World Wide Web provided a less hierarchical structure than traditional printed media. Michael Gorman argues that it was a more rhizomatic communicative structure that is nonlinear and non-hierarchical, which specifically gave rise to the phenomenon of Alexei Navalny. He, that is Navalny, truly began his political career as a citizen journalist, one with legal training that he aimed at exposing federal corruption. Navalny made his name through investigative blog and net-based exposés, including revelations that billions of state dollars were embezzled in the Transneft oil pipeline construction project, forcing Putin's government to investigate. The Russian blogosphere that emerged in the early 2000s snuck in under the radar of Putin's new government, as it served as a useful mechanism for, in Gorman's words, letting off steam within a minority group of more critical Russians without threatening the generally accepting attitudes of the less digitally connected majority. That is, the powers that be underestimated the power of these citizen journalist efforts. As interest and participation grew, Navalny developed an even more stable and more accessible expose projects, which meant more participation and more visibility. Navalny's first citizen watchdog project was Reischl, an interactive site that allowed citizens to report official mismanagement of federal funds and tracked cases as they progressed, so again, crowdsourcing. The second project took off even more. Rosyama began later in 2011 and targeted the poor state of Russia's roads. It allowed drivers to upload photographs and the location of potholes and other road hazards to the site, and then automatically notified local traffic police. If the obstruction is not fixed after 37 days, a notification will be sent to prosecutors. Now, both projects relied on participatory social internet applications, or what is called Web 2.0 technology. It was a way to create a grassroots, crowdsourced effort to expose the wrongdoings of those in power. And this is, again, that power of one to amplify the voice of the collective. The power of the collective voice is also essential when we consider the expose work that Solzhenitsyn took on in his massive Gulag archipelago. Solzhenitsyn's authority is defined, of course, by his proximity to events in his own life, his identity as a Zek, as a Gulag prisoner, but also to his network of people and of documents. As he asserts, the book could never have been created by one person alone. Material for this book was given to him in reports, memoirs, and letters by 227 witnesses whose names were not initially listed within the space of the Gulag archipelago, but later on were. And this is a slightly hard to read networking map. It shows the works of Solzhenitsyn in the middle and the connections to his many helpers, those who gave him material as well as those who hid his documents from authorities too. Here. He also acknowledges that the content for his Gulag archipelago was provided by 36 Soviet writers, authors of the disgraceful book on the White Sea Canal. But in order to incorporate this work, Solzhenitsyn would need to physically recover the book itself as well. By 1937, many of the officials featured in this propaganda work, dedicated to the Belmore construction project, were blacklisted or purged. And most prominently, this included the former head of the NKVD, who's not pictured here, but for effect, I give it here. The purged figure was Yagada, but here we have Yezhov actually being purged. But once these individuals were purged, the book was also removed from libraries as well as private collections. And this is a reminder, too, that as you are disappeared from life, you are also disappeared from the photographic record, that these two go hand in hand. The technology of reproduction, the reproduction of these images, is a key feature of how this book came to be through and in a network of zeks, that is, this network here. One of Solzhenitsyn's first tasks in incorporating the history of construction, that banned book, involves an archaeological investigation simply to obtain a copy, which was finally achieved through a friend and fellow zek. The second step necessary to incorporate the unearthed book would be most likely through photography. In volume 3, that's not one we have sitting here, of the original YMCA Paris Press publication of the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn incorporates images from the history of construction in both the chapter The Archipelago Metastasizes, and actually is the cover image of the book. And I don't have that cover image, I have this one. But note that this image here you've seen before in the history of construction. In the history of construction, the photograph, the orchestra on the canal, illustrated a text that described how music lifted the spirits of the prisoners and in turn increased their productivity. Through his own first-hand witness, a member of the band, Solzhenitsyn challenges the evidentiary truth of that account in his own reinscription of the image. He says, "They put the band on the shore and it played for several days in a row until prisoners working without relief or rest periods had unloaded timber from a barge. IDT, his fellow zek, was in a band at Bellamore, and he recalls, they used to shout at us, parasites, drones, come here and get to work. In the photograph, neither this nor anything like it is shown." Here, Solzhenitsyn imbues the public image with a singular voice. What was once a photograph standing in for the generalized and idealized experience of those imprisoned at Bellamore is transformed into a conduit for an individual prisoner whose voice can call out with his own story from the frames of the photograph. It bears testimony to the power of Solzhenitsyn's authorial project as a zek and as a witness himself to correct the interpretation of the evidentiary truth of the photographs. And of course, in so doing, he might even be calling out the whole notion of documentary at all into question. This photograph can tell far too many stories. And as a side note too, I want to say, camera technology served as an essential function in getting the Gulag Archipelago into print too. Because Solzhenitsyn was suffering under the confines of Soviet censorship, and knowing that the discovery of his manuscripts would of course lead to re-incarceration, if not worse, Solzhenitsyn relied on photography, and especially microfilm, to prepare and transport the manuscripts of the Gulag Archipelago to the Parisian publishers, who would eventually publish this version, the first version of the Gulag Archipelago. And that did include the images from the history of construction as well. In this sense, Solzhenitsyn actually harnesses the technology of the prison record to ensure that his writings would become part of a human record. And what is, I think, even more, in this symbolic reclamation of photography, we can consider the history of cameras and their development in the Soviet Union. A really important turn in Soviet photography was the development of the FED camera, which is a less expensive German Leica, a handheld camera. These were actually made in special camps here, and this is a feature on that special camp. And does anybody know what the initials stand for? This would be a deep dive into Soviet history. It's Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the secret police as well. His name was on the camera too, this notorious head of the Cheka. And in the first years of its making, this camera also bore the initials of another precursor to the inheritor of the Cheka, that is the NKVD, again, our secret police. Now, if we return to looking at Navalny in particular, look at the way he is regularly pictured by the system of authority that incarcerated him. We see that a great majority of the images posted to articles about Navalny, and not by Navalny, are screen grabs from court appearances. Navalny time and again is shown to be literally behind bars. He can and does speak, he looks at the camera, but everything about the court spectacle in Russia is aimed to reinforce and affirm the position of prisoner, not respected citizen. So I'm thinking through these images in aggregate just now. We have also another moment like this one that I'd stop on, and I think that this is a moment where Navalny's figure seems to break through, even as we have the repetition within the image of his incarceration in two places in this scene. Were he to respect the bars, it would be a very different picture as well. But here, he's hunched over, he's leaning out. I also find this one from January 11th to be particularly heartbreaking. He is further distant from the camera, and you can get that sense too in how blurry this feed is. He is clearly far more ill, and the red light filter seems to presage what is to come. Now, in his own post to social media, Navalny and his team choose a different and distinctly Navalnyian tactic. What do you see here? Wonder how you read. What's your immediate response? It's from June 2nd, last year. What is this? What are you even looking at? Kangaroo court? Yeah, kangaroo court, absolutely. How is that made? You think, how is this image put, I'm already leading us on, put together, right? Not a possible photograph at all. Here we have the memification of incarceration. This is Navalny's absurdist take on picturing a too literal kangaroo court. The post begins with this picture that we have there on the left, followed by reproductions of several court rulings, which he outlines in the text that accompanies the post. So again, if we're thinking about harnessing the technology or means of incarceration. It includes 9 requests denied by the Russian court, each of which are requests of increasing absurdity, from a request for a balalaika, denied, nunchucks, denied, to a stress-relieving massage chair, to a request to know the guard dogs' names, so he says parenthetically so he can make friends with them, to the final ask, which Navalny ironically calls the most important, to receive a permit to keep a kangaroo. I was rejected, and that's what this document is. He says, because a kangaroo, in the quote of the ruling, is a double incisor marsupial, I will continue to fight for my inalienable right to own a kangaroo. I will leave this for just a moment and return once again to a brief and closer look at a few Solzhenitsyn photographs we have seen in passing thus far. I want to pause on a particularly striking and often reproduced image from the Gulag archipelago. Now again, I'm going to ask what you see. So what do you notice here? How would you read, what are the questions you would ask of an image like this one? Especially given what you've seen so far. What is it trying to say? We can say it's saying anything. He looks scared, yeah. So we start to read the body language. This is presenting us a very material. We're looking for his face to understand emotions. We're looking at the material to understand his condition. Does it matter who took the photograph? To you?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So do we know who took it?
The photograph clearly shows Solzhenitsyn in his prison garb, documentary effect. But the scene is staged. It's not a shot taken within the Gulag, as it's often assumed to be mistakenly, in articles and posthumously published writings that include the author's photograph. This is a picture in the Gulag. One immediately upon release, it would have been taken by authorities were that the case. But almost immediately upon his release and subsequent exile to Kazakhstan, Solzhenitsyn posed in this prisoner's uniform in front of a white background. And he did actually have to secret out this prisoner's uniform in order to take this photograph. It's even another act of reclamation. In one sense, it's a document of the Zek Solzhenitsyn, the visual proof of his image as a prisoner. He sits slightly hunched over with the weight of his experience on his exhausted shoulders. And I think back to that pose of Navalny reaching through the bars of his cell, also on that video feed with that weight. Here, Solzhenitsyn calls on us to confront the double system of photographic portraiture, a system of representation capable of functioning both honorifically and repressively. Unlike the photograph taken of Solzhenitsyn by Soviet authorities at the time of arrest, or any photograph of Solzhenitsyn taken within the camp, here the author has actually defined his own subjectivity. He self-consciously shapes his pose and his garb, chooses the time of the photograph. He has taken complete control of his prisoner identity by posing one more time before the camera. Moreover, the placement of the image in the work, it's an authorial frontispiece in Volume 3, concretizes the link between Zec and author. The photograph is confirmation, serious and stoic, of Solzhenitsyn's assertion of a vision of his authorial persona. Solzhenitsyn is first and foremost a Zec, even when he is no longer physically confined in a Gulag camp. Now, returning to Navalny, we see a new Zec use a different facet of the prison experience, the absurdity of its own logic. Navalny's powerful irony and absurdist laughter emphasizes the absolute ridiculousness of his position and the two realities of his existence. One, that he is trapped in a horrific Russian prison, but two, that he can speak to authority and make it speak back, amplifying the absurdity of the rules of law that bind him there. Navalny's unique position means visibility, and at every turn he maximized that visibility, be it an Instagram post or a well-timed, charming smile at the cameras trained on him. His prison platforms, not based in Russian media but available to a Russian and Western audience, continue to reproduce this message and his image not only for him, but for the many voices that might speak out against corruption, even when the photos themselves are not from his prison cell. And some closing reflections. Susan Sontag's statement does contain a partial truth. There are no photographs of the Gulag which can stand alone as authentic representations of life there. And notwithstanding his creation of a monument to his tribe and self in his vast literary experiment, Solzhenitsyn still exists within those frames. Such is also the conclusion of Harriet Marov, who states that Solzhenitsyn cannot claim mastery over the Gulag. There's no end. Solzhenitsyn tells us to the supplements that could be added to it. Out of the work there emerges an image of its author, broken and remade and always scarred by the Gulag and the writing of the Gulag archipelago. Navalny's crusade did come to an end, but certainly the corruption he aimed to expose lives on. There is no end in sight. Navalny was never able to best the system that ultimately killed him, but he did reveal a method to mobilize a following and amplify a voice of dissent. In contrast to that picture of Solzhenitsyn, Navalny and his team created an icon of charismatic defiance, humor, and subversion. Following his tragic death in February, his widow, Yulia Navalnaya, has publicly vowed to continue his anti-corruption work and continues to appear regularly in his stead and post to his social media accounts. We await the publication of Navalny's memoir, which she now has in her hands. The effect of these efforts, without the charismatic body of Navalny in the picture, will remain to be seen. The danger I think we now face is to lose interest, to look away now that we do not have that same fascinating center. Without our pull, I say us in the West, to see proof of life, will we still pay as much attention to Navalny as we did in the months leading to his passing? Time will tell. But as we know today, due to that speedy power of photographic and now digital imaging, powerful voices can continue to speak through these images even after the individuals are gone. Thank you.
Questions? You have questions, we know that.
And even if you just want to go back and look at some of the pictures too, we can rest on some and investigate further.
So pass around these two editions
Yeah.
that were published in France, not in Soviet Union.
Yeah.
You know?
He was able to post from jail.
Yeah.
He was posting on Instagram from jail.
So it was through his lawyer. So he did have this conduit, and I think that this is what is really obviously quite distinctly different about this. What I'd say too, there's a performance in the way he posts. There's also a performance in the way that Russian justice works today, right? This is a way in which he has representation that looks seemingly fair and democratic, but that's all he has is access to his lawyer, but only when the authorities allow that to happen. Which is why there are generally very few images of him actually in prison unless they are from official court feeds. Otherwise, they choose clearly, his social team, his lawyer, choose these images, but this is purportedly the text that he hands to his lawyers.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good clarification. How does it get out is an important part of the story.
So is the widow using, I haven't been paying attention to her posts, is she using humor at all? Or is she, as a woman, is she allowed to? As a widow, can she?
I've been asking this question, I was looking for it, and I was hoping to see, but there is kind of a break in her postings. It is much more an emotional plea. It's much more a play on her loss, right, of course, and it's very heartfelt, focused on the loss of her husband, father, figure, and that she's now called to fill his place, but that's not her public persona, is certainly not his, and I do think it's gendered, I agree with you.
Do you see a difference between, I'm thinking of, I can't remember, Brittany Greer
Yeah.
and Evan, Wall Street Journal. Yeah. How are they using media or not? And why do you think that is?
That's a really good question, and I just don't think that it has the same reach, right? This is where I would say with Navalny, what has been particularly unique is that he is built on his social media presence, right? It has this almost straight trajectory from his early work in the blogosphere to today. So it was already a powerful machine. So it has this incredible amount of visibility. Yeah. So I haven't seen the same. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just hasn't impacted, these circles.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Can you tell us who photographed Solzhenitsyn and
Nikolai Zubov is his name. So he and a friend, so his fellow Zek, they immediately after release were like, we're going to get a camera. That's what they did. The first thing they did was get a camera to make sure they could take pictures of each other. And then, and he says this in the Gulag Archipelago, the question to them was, how can we harness this technology to meet our ends? And so he says it was he and Zubov, another Zek, released at the same time. Took these pictures in Kazakhstan.
And then the pictures that were staged in Gulag,
Yeah.
So who took them?
Mostly Rodchenko. So it's mostly Alexander Rodchenko took these. Not all of them though. Some of them were taken by other photographers. They're not credited. This is very distinctly different. Because this is an experimental collective work, in fact. This was a brief moment before the advent of what's called socialist realism, where they were experimenting with the play on documentary works that would show reforging and show the mastery of Soviet peoples over nature. And they thought they could do this with a band of authors best, instead of singular authors, to celebrate socialist collectivity. But there's only a few books that actually did this successfully. They realized that was not a great model pretty quickly. But it was several authors as well as a brigade of photographers that also accompanied the authors. But even someone as one of my favorites, Reischl, was a photographer, an author who shows up here, but also wrote his own Bellamore book. Some other famous figures who were invited but didn't go include Ilfin Petrov, was supposed to be part of the brigade, but they were not. Shklovsky was an important part of the brigade, too, of this collective project. Yeah. And then for the USSR in construction issue, these are all Rodchenko photographs.
I mean, you mentioned that Zonta says that there are no authentic photographs.
Yeah.
And I think the word authentic is problematic because every photograph is sort of mediated in itself and constructed with a lens. So why does she enforce that?
Well, what she is responding to is a Western perspective circa 1973. So in 1973, the West didn't remember seeing photographs of the Gulag. So it's how I unfortunately use her as a straw man in this. It's simply that it had not landed yet. And Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago had not landed yet. And the opening of that experience and the fact that these photographs do exist had not been fully opened to the West as of yet. But I think what really she's responding to in making this generalization is to say, we just don't have as many photographs as we have of the liberation of Nazi concentration camps, which would be an equivalency for her. Yeah, but certainly that's it. It's all about the contingency of the photographs, that they can tell many, many different stories. Right? And here, it's about telling the triumphant victory of man over nature.
So Russian is like Lenin Stop.
Yeah, and he struggled with this a lot. He called this his perestroika, actually, rather than perikovka. So his own restructuring of himself, going to the Belmore Canal. Almost every author or photographer who was sent there found this to be a reckoning point for them in their allegiance to being a Soviet author or photographer. What does it mean to actually look at the Gulag and see it and have to tell a different story than what they saw? Zoshenko is another important author who's here. Has anybody read Zoshenko?
No, but we read Grossman.
You read Grossman? Zoshenko is, I highly recommend, very, very funny, except in his chapter of the history of the White Sea construction project. But he's a Soviet, incredibly famous and important and funny Soviet satirist. His stories are fantastic. But here he had to write the story of one reforging, so the story of one prisoner and how he turned his life around. When I did work with this archive, it's clear that that is an amalgamation of many people. But he said it was one person that he met, a criminal who reforged his life at the canal.
And how did you decide to choose Solzhenitsyn, not Shalom? I mean, Shalom was destroyed by the Gulag, whereas Solzhenitsyn...
That's why Shalom did not like Solzhenitsyn. He says Solzhenitsyn had it easy in his camps. He doesn't know what it was like to be in Kalima. Actually, in many ways, there are a lot of parallels to moments with much more time. Shalomov would be another great voice to bring into this picture. There are a couple, the tragedy of what Navalny was articulating that he saw outside his window here looks almost exactly like a Shalomov story called Детские картинки, or children's drawings. And it's all about the confines, the horrific confines of the Gulag. And a children's drawing that only sees German shepherds and barbed wire. And it almost feels like a quote hidden in this post to Shalomov. Similarly, the absolute absurdity of the prison condition, something like Prosthetic Devices, another short story by Shalomov, feels like it's also drawn in this same sort of absurd and terrifying vernacular. In this story, all of the prisoners have to take off all of their prosthetic devices before they're sent into solitary confinement. And the very last line of the story is, "What do I have to give up to you, my soul?" Right, it's this heartrending short story about the Gulag. So it's only to say this became about media, and Shalomov is not about media. That's the only reason for the confines here, but it doesn't mean he wouldn't be an important interlocutor in this story too. Even as much as Solzhenitsyn and he did not get on. Shalomov was invited to be a part of the Gulag archipelago, and he said, absolutely not, I don't like you. I'm not invited us about this project.
So in this lecture, you were comparing Solzhenitsyn and Navalny.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, has Navalny said anything publicly about the influence of Solzhenitsyn on the way he expresses dissent, or the way he communicates with others about his dissent?
Not that I came across in building out these thoughts. It shows up here and there in different sort of, and I call these again kind of straw man setups. You'll see these headlines that are like, it's like Solzhenitsyn, and then that's all you get. So how is it like Solzhenitsyn was the question I was trying to answer. But nothing so direct in what I had seen and what I was diving into. Yeah.
No, I think in both cases, it's dissidents who had the West as one of their major audiences.
Exactly.
And so, which Shalomov and the rest, Zoshenko.
That's another piece of it, right? These are all, they are both reliant on the West and didn't necessarily vibe with a Western liberalism, but were absolutely reliant on that in order to get their still distinctly dissident Russian message out into the world. And I think in both cases, to survive. Right? Solzhenitsyn was expelled because he was famous. He had won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970. He couldn't disappear again. He had to be expelled in 73 when Soviet authorities found Gulag archipelago. What we have here is actually, in many ways, more of a surprise than not, but just a sign of how absolutely dark Putin's Russia has become. But Navalny did not survive. I'm so sorry to end Monday on such an incredibly starting week. I know. Yeah.
Why do you think they kept requesting him instead of finding ways to keep him there? Initially, he just said this thing that a lot of Nazis do like a bogus charge to him.
Yeah, that is such a great question. I would love a political scholar to weigh in on exactly this, because from the outside, as a media scholar, this is much more, to me, about the performance of it. He has good lawyers, and most of these charges are likely completely made up. And it also speaks to the capriciousness of the Russian legal system. They're also, almost all of the time, changing the laws, shifting the interpretation of them, so that they can be re-aimed at opponents to the regime, or anyone that might need to be subdued at any given moment, and that's what you have here. So in short runs, there will be an amount of protest, and then let him out. It's also a play showing that Putin's regime, that Moscow is in power and has the power to put you in prison and can also let you out. So maybe, be quiet now, right? And then he's not quiet, and so he gets rearrested and resentenced. But that's my layperson's take on that concern, on that question.
So can we make a comparison and statement between the Putin's regime and the Solzhenitsyn Stalin's regime?
I think that what is surprising, maybe not surprising, that there is continuity too in that capriciousness, that it's very difficult to be on the inside and understand the operations. And here, you have a megalomaniac who's making decisions pretty singularly in order to stay in power. And what Navalny represented, and this is very distinct from Solzhenitsyn, Navalny represented an actual political threat. His rise was an actual political threat. Solzhenitsyn was a voice that could be read as a voice of dissent, of exposing something that was meant to stay hidden in a Soviet past. And these are different kinds of power structures, but certainly in both cases, they are revealing things that keep the powerful in power. And when you do that, it subverts the system in both cases.
Okay, questions? Good, wonderful. Okay, let's thank Professor Hill. Elementary Russian, is anyone interested to sign up?
I couldn't have done this without elementary Russian.
Yeah, you see?
And 15 more years